small-scale poultry and egg production with the Small Farms Network. My name is Alex James, and it's a pleasure to be online with you today. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The Small Farms Network Capital Region has been rethinking how we deliver training events for small farmers over the next few months in ways that allow you to keep learning farm skills when it's not safe to meet in one place because of COVID-19. The webinar format is allowing us to reach new audiences from wider afield, so it is a very exciting time for us. Some of you will have met me at workshops, so it's nice to say hello from my home to yours. To all our new participants, welcome and thanks for joining us here today. I have my camera switched off today because I've had a surgery done on my face. So thankfully, we have two special guests who will have their cameras on throughout the webinar. So just a little bit about the network. We are a community-based group led by farmers for farmers based just outside of Canberra. Our services include organising workshops and webinars, newsletters, organising group vaccination programs for livestock, such as our Goodyear vaccination clinic for sheep. We also have a Facebook page and a website packed full of information. Most of our workshops are hosted on small farms, giving you skills-based information where and when you need it. We offer annual memberships for a range of services, including a member's email, advance notice of events, and special member events. Membership is available through our website. Our committee is run by volunteers, and what an amazing group they are. Their hard work makes this webinar possible. Thanks to Haji Dusinza and Alice McGlashan for all their help in designing this webinar. The Small Farms Network received funding from the Every Bit Counts project through the Environmental Trust. Thank you to the staff at New South Wales Local Land Services for their ongoing support, and in particular thanks to Lou Baskind for her time in helping organise and present at this webinar. Thanks to Wendy Hutton and her husband Warren. Wendy is our other guest speaker today. Thanks for hosting me at your farm last week and also being online to answer questions here. So I'm just going to explain to you a little bit how you can participate in the webinar today. So you will notice that your video is turned off and you are muted, so no one can see you or hear you throughout our recording or our webinar today. You'll see that there is a chat function there that you can, if you click on that chat function, you will see that you'll have a Zoom webinar chat box where you can type in your question either to the panelists or to everybody. So if you type in there and it says all panelists and attendees, then everyone can see that and it will be included in our recording. If you choose just to send it to the panelists, only the panelists will see your question, but it won't be recorded for future reference. If you have a question for either Wendy or Lou throughout the webinar, it'd be great if you could just type their name at the beginning, just so that we know who you're wanting to direct the question to. You can change your screen view to gallery or to speaker view when you throughout the webinar. So I can see that Joanne has raised her hand, and I will address that in a moment, Joanne. After the webinar, you will be directed to a post-webinar survey. It would be wonderful if you could complete this survey and help us plan to improve our webinars. You can also provide any feedback to me via email. The webinar will run for approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. If we have a lot of questions, it may go for 5 to 10 minutes longer. Lou will present for about 20 minutes and I will be showing you a video of Wendy's farm, and after that we'll have a question and answer session. So I hope you can stay with us and enjoy the webinar. So it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today. So this is not Wendy, but this is Wendy's rooster, Cluck Norris. So I have to get his name right. And Wendy's farm. Wendy has a small mixed enterprise just outside of Canberra. And also Dr. Lou Baskind, the District Veterinarian based in Braidwood from Southeast Local Land Services. Lou has joined us several times before at Small Farms events, and we are delighted to have her with us to present this webinar today. Lou has a passion for small farms and backyard chickens and is a great supporter of farmers big and small. And now I'm just going to stop my screen share and hand over the controls to Lou. So that won't take a sec, you just bear with us there. Hi, Lou.
Hi, Alex. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'll just get my presentation shared for you now. How's that, Alex? Is that the presentation up now?
Yep, we can see that really well now. Thanks, Lou.
Great, fantastic. All right, I'll get started. So, as Alex said, I'm the district vet with Local Land Services in Braidwood. I'm really interested in farming on a small scale and poultry in particular. And I've dabbled a little bit myself, having produced some meat chickens just in my small backyard system. So what I want to cover today, now, what you're going to get from me today is essentially, as you're sort of moving from that space of just having a few poultry in the backyard for yourself and looking at the possibility of maybe expanding that into a sort of small production level, is just thinking about some of the legal requirements of that. And I also want to get you starting to think about biosecurity. So biosecurity essentially is the measures you take to prevent pests and diseases coming into your flock. And number one, that's an animal welfare issue. But number two, when you're on a production scale, pests and diseases can really knock your business. It can really affect production, and it can cost money. So we'll start to just think about how you're going to prevent those pests and diseases coming in. And we'll talk about vaccination a little bit. So vaccination can be a really good tool for diseases that are hard to control with biosecurity alone. Now, there's going to be a lot of links and references through this presentation. And don't worry too much about trying to scribble them down while I'm talking. I'm sure Alex will upload this presentation onto the Small Farms website. So just keep checking back there if you want to get to those references. Now, if you're sort of here looking for information about basic husbandry and common pests and diseases, I'd just encourage you to go back and look at our online seminar from a fortnight ago. And also there's a sort of fairly comprehensive article about that I wrote in our animal health update that covers on those basics. So go back and have a look at that as well. So let's talk a little bit about the legal requirements. So this is just going to be a general guide of things to think about. And obviously for your specific circumstances, get advice directly from the council or the food authority, etc. But it's just going to be an overview of what you need to be thinking about. So local council, definitely worth touching base with them about the rules. So the reason for local council regulations is that, activities that you undertake on your private property can still have an impact on other people and the environment. So there are sometimes rules about what you can and can't do, especially in certain zones. And if you're in a more urban zone, the rules are usually more stringent. So make sure you're checking with your own local council before you go into production side of things. My understanding is that in general, you don't need to apply for development consent if you've got less than 1,000 birds, but again, get your specific advice for your situation. And there may be some rules about how many birds you're allowed in total, whether or not you're allowed to have roosters at all. And there are sometimes rules around construction of the housing for the birds, where you can actually locate that and what materials you're supposed to be using. So the next thing to think about are food regulations. So those are regulations that are in place so that the people that consume the food that you produce are safe from disease and chemical residues. And it allows them to know that they're making a sort of informed choice about what they're eating. So that's why those are in place there. The agency that that puts out those regulations and is involved in sort of monitoring and maintaining those is the New South Wales Food Authority. You can definitely call them and ask them specifically about your situation, what you need to comply with, but I'll give you a general overview now. So essentially, if you're producing less than 200 pigs per week and you're supplying that from the farm gate, you just need to notify the New South Wales Food Authority of your activities. So there's no stringent licensing or anything like that, but you do need to do a notification. If you're not supplying out of the farm gate, so for example, you're taking those eggs to a farmer's market, you also need to have an egg stamp. So that just allows for better traceability. If there is a notification to say, you know, there's been some disease in people and they want to try and trace that, if the person can say, oh, I remember I bought my eggs from such and such farm gate, that's easy enough. But if they've bought from somewhere else, they may not know where the origin of those eggs are. So you get that egg stamp and you stamp that onto the egg shell. The egg stamp is supplied by the Food Authority when you notify. There's also a rule not to sell a cracked egg at all. One thing that you can look at to try and reduce the number of cracked eggs that you have is actually making sure that your nutrition is correct. So eggshell quality will be very related to nutrition. Protein, calcium, phosphorus, and vitamin D are the key nutrients there. Healthy chickens are more likely to have healthy shells. And also, as birds get older, the shells tend to get thinner, so the risk becomes higher for cracked eggs. So just thinking about how you'll manage the flock as the hens are aging as well. Collecting the eggs regularly so that eggs aren't sitting in the nest box as new chickens come to lay in the same place and standing on them is another way to reduce that cracking. You're also not to sell an egg that has any visible feces or soiling on it. Something that can help with that is making sure that the birds have somewhere to perch at night and they're not sleeping in the laying box. So providing the right kind of perch will help, and then collecting your eggs often. So once a day, even twice a day if you can. It's preferable not to wash an egg at all. If you do your washing incorrectly, it can actually suck the bacteria through the porous shell into the inside of the egg. So you're better off not washing. So there's a bit of soiling on there, just some, you know, paper towel or a scour or something, just brush it off. Now, if you're looking at meat chickens and you're looking at raising those meat chickens for sale for meat, if you have less than 100 birds being grown out at any one time, again, not super stringent licensing, but you do need to notify the Food Authority, and there are some standards you need to adhere to. You need to be willing to be inspected and audited from time to time. Now, there's a really important point here. Not everybody knows this, but if you want to sell meat for human consumption, it has to go through a licensed abattoir. You can't slaughter birds on farm and sell that meat on. So any birds that are killed on farm are for home consumption only. Something to really consider if you're looking at meat production is to factor in where you're going to get those chickens butchered and what's the cost going to be for your business as well to do that. Just a point here on if you are killing birds on farm for home consumption, it's important, I'm sure it's important to all of us to think about how to do that in the most humane way possible. And there are different opinions on what is the most humane. You'll probably, if you're looking into it and reading about it, you might come across the term euthanasia. Now, this is not euthanasia. Euthanasia is when you're having to humanely kill them to relieve pain and suffering. Humane slaughter is different, so there should be no urgency about it. And it means that you should be able to prepare the appropriate equipment and follow all the appropriate stages as best as possible. Now, all the guidelines for the most humane slaughter suggest these 4 stages. a stress-free initial handling, good physical restraint of the bird. And then there's the stunning stage. Not everybody's stunning stage, and I encourage you to have a look at whether your business could get some kind of equipment to actually do the stunning. Now, stunning means you basically render them unconscious before the actual killing process, and there is some equipment to do that. In the commercial setting, it's a water bath with an electric current, and that means that the bird's unconscious. So have a look into that if you're doing any sort of slaughter at home. There's some links here to some great guidelines looking at all the different ways to have the most humane slaughter on farm. Now, the other thing you need to make sure you're doing if you're selling any eggs or meat for consumption is abiding by rules for medicines and chemicals. So you may have situations where you want to use medicines or chemicals for parasite management. Sometimes the feed for young birds includes medicines in there as well, or if you do have a disease that you're managing with antibiotics. So you might need to make sure you're not using any medicines that are not registered to use in chickens, and you have to use them according to the label. When you use those medicines, there will be something on there called a withholding period. So that's the time from using the treatment to when you can start collecting the eggs or slaughter the animal for meat again. And that period of time starts when the treatment finishes. So just to be really clear, an egg that's collected during the treatment period or during the withholding period, the chemical in the egg does not get less and less over time. That egg needs to be discarded. You need to wait and then only sell eggs after the withholding period of time. You're also not allowed to take those eggs in the withholding period and feed them on to another food-producing species. And this is just to ensure that there aren't undue levels of chemical residues in the food that people are eating. Because there may be people that are, you know, a lot of people say, oh, well, I eat the eggs during the withholding period and I'm fine. That may be true, but there may be people who are sensitive to those chemicals. They could have allergies, or it could be a sort of toxic level of a residue for them. If you want more information about the chemicals that you are using and to be clear about withholding periods and use instructions, the APVMA has this great portal that you can look up any of the registered chemicals there. Another thing in terms of your legal obligations is a property identification code. You need one of those if you have 100 or more small poultry in total, and you can apply for that through local land services. That's again another tool that we use if we're trying to do any tracing of chemical residue issues in the food chain or disease outbreaks. The Biosecurity Act has it's basically legislation that's designed to sort of make it a shared responsibility of everybody in the community to control the spread and introduction of pests and diseases and weeds and contaminants, etc. And you have a duty under this act. It basically is you just have an obligation to be aware of what's going on, and if it appears that there might be the spread of disease, is to take some kind of action, to do something about it as best you can. And in the circumstance where you may have a small poultry production going on, the main thing that you really need to know is about your duty to notify. So that's about letting somebody else know, sort of letting an authority know if you think something's going on with spread of disease and pests. There is a list of notifiable diseases for poultry, but I really don't have an expectation that you would memorize this list and know how to identify it in all of your birds. I think just use this rule of thumb. If you've got sick birds, particularly in excess of what you'd normally expect, especially if it's sudden or the symptoms are unusual, just notify. There's no harm in notifying. We're not going to say, oh, you're so silly, didn't you know it was this or that? We'd rather just get the information and then assess it. So if any reason there's something going on that you're not sure about, just notify. It's quite easy to do. There's a few different options. There's a hotline that you can ring. The number's there for you now. And you ring and the operator will ask you a few details and you'll leave a message, and someone Usually someone from the Department of Primary Industries or local land services will give you a call back a couple of hours later and talk to you about it in more detail. You can also talk to your biosecurity officers or district vets directly in local land services. So you can just contact us directly, or you can contact the Department of Primary Industries as well. So as I was saying, I just wanted to get you thinking about biosecurity as a concept. So I've popped up a photo there. That was us going in to sample a big commercial property for Salmonella enteritidis. And we've, you know, there's big gates saying don't enter, and we're fully decked out in our gear there. Not expecting this level of biosecurity day to day on your small farm, but just want to cover some of the ideas to just get you thinking. So as I said, biosecurity, it's just measures to prevent those pests and diseases coming in and to prevent their onward spread, either within your own flock or sort of moving on to the next property. Have a look at the Farm Biosecurity website, great toolkit and resources there to help you make your own biosecurity plan. So just start thinking essentially about how can pests and diseases get into your flock. So these are some of the pathways that I thought of, carried in by new chickens. When you buy new chickens in, remember that buying fertile eggs, that also has the potential for bringing disease in. There are some diseases that will actually transmit from the hen into the egg. Wild birds will come in, and if they have contact with your chickens, can spread pests and diseases. People, so if you've got visitors who have their own chickens and they're wearing the same clothing and shoes that they were tending to their chickens with, or the other poultry, just have a think about that as well. Any equipment, transport cages, think about where your water's coming from, and any other inputs that come into the farm. So, you know, if you went and bought some organic fertilizer to spread out, there may be something to think about there. There's a great video on YouTube. I've popped the link there for you, called Exhibition Bird Biosecurity. It's just a really nice summary of how people who exhibit their birds at shows are managing their biosecurity, because obviously they're moving birds on and off the farm. But some of the principles there are really useful. So as I mentioned, bringing in new birds is a real risk for bringing in disease. So I really strongly encourage you to quarantine any new birds that come in for 3 weeks. So you don't want them having direct contact with your home flock, but also no indirect contact. And what I mean by that is, don't go and tend to the new birds and then wear the same shoes and clothing and go to your home flock, and don't allow them somewhere where respiratory droplets, for example, think about it, you know, similar to what we're doing at the moment with COVID-19, is that physical distancing. So if a chicken happens to sneeze, you don't want that sneeze to reach your home flock. So a solid barrier is a good idea, making sure they're not upwind from your home flock, and monitor them for any signs of illness. If they appear not quite right, please don't mix them. Once you get a disease into your flock, very, very hard to get it out without having to do culling. Okay, so I'll just quickly review some things about vaccination. So I do encourage vaccination, but it's quite problematic when you're doing it on a small scale. So we'll have a look at some of the issues there. There's lots of different diseases that you can potentially vaccinate for. And here's an example, just of a schedule of vaccines that laying chickens may receive in the commercial system between the age of sort of hatching and 14 weeks. You can see there's lots of different vaccines that come into the mix there, some of them multiple times. But the challenges on the small scale is that transport and storage of vaccine products is tricky. They often need to be on dry ice in cold storage. The complexity of mixing the vaccines to get them in a usable format, reconstituting them, is pretty technical. I've just slipped in a link there. There's a video there that can show you how it's done in the backyard system, but it just needs a little bit of precision. The products come in a really high number of doses and a very short time to use them. So it's not necessarily going to be very cost efficient in terms of cost per bird. And also you might not know in your system, you know, do we even have these diseases here? Is this actually a risk? So it can be hard to make that risk assessment to know whether you should be vaccinating or not. I'll talk about a couple of specific diseases. I'm going to start with Marek's disease. So Marek's disease is actually a virus that ends up causing a cancer in the bird. And what it does is it infects them really early in life, but then they only show signs later on. And you usually are starting to see symptoms in the birds somewhere between the age of 4 weeks, but all the way up to about 18 months old, even though they've been infected as young chicks. And it can cause all sorts of different syndromes. There's one called fowl paralysis, which there's a picture of there, where you see them with one leg sticking forward and one leg back. It can cause internal tumours, immune suppression, blindness, all sorts of things. It's spread through the feather and skin cells, and it can survive a long time. So if you've got dust and dander that's come off the chickens, that can harbour the Marek's disease in your system for a really, really long time. So why would you vaccinate against this disease? Well, it's a very common disease. It's very hard to keep out using just biosecurity because you have birds that are asymptomatic carriers. It's very hard to tell, almost impossible to tell if a bird has Marek's disease or not, and there's no treatment for it. And if you get an outbreak of Marek's, up to 60% of the chickens that are infected could die over a period of time. So it can have a really serious impact. So it's a good idea in that case to vaccinate for it. However, there's some caveats to that because it's a little bit tricky. In order for the vaccine to work, it has to take effect before the chicken is ever exposed to the virus. So if you're going to hatch chicks under a broody hen, they potentially are getting exposed from the moment that they come out of the egg. So usually if you're going to vaccinate for Marek's, what you need to do is you actually need to use an artificial brooder with clean litter, and they're in there for at least 3 weeks, having been vaccinated at 1 day old before they then go into the flock. So vaccinating and using broody hens doesn't really work very well. There's some other strategies that you can use for management of Marek's. So you can vaccinate the breeding hen, and then she maybe will pass on a little bit of antibodies into the egg as well. That can help with that new little chick facing Marek's disease early in life. And also resistance to Marek's disease is quite heritable in the genetics. So I definitely encourage you, if you are looking at breeding birds, we call it breeding for vigor. So you wait until they're old enough that you can say they've safely out of the likelihood of having Marek's disease, so over that 18 months to 2 years sort of age, and they're vigorously healthy, and those are the birds that you're going to breed for the next generation. So another common disease that you can vaccinate for is fowl pox. So that, again, it's a virus. You get these sort of wart-like skin lesions and scabs. Can get a bit of a respiratory sign with it as well. In most cases, it's fairly minor in its effect on the chickens. You don't often get chickens dying from it, but it is this sort of slow spreading disease that goes around the whole flock, makes them quite depressed. They don't really want to eat, and the egg production will drop significantly. So if you've got small scale production where you're trying to make a little bit of an income through selling those eggs, and your egg production drops right off, it can be quite devastating to the business. So again, why would you vaccinate for fowl pox? Well, again, it's very common, and it's another one that's hard to control just with biosecurity because it's actually spread by mosquitoes, and that can be hard to prevent the movement of mosquitoes into your flock. And again, it can, as I said, it can significantly drop your egg production for as long as a 10-week period, which will really knock the income from your egg business. Other vaccines, as I said, there's lots of other vaccines available. On a small scale, there's none that I specifically recommend other than the Marek's and the fowl pox. You'll use them as needed and in consultation with your vet, essentially. So if it's known that there's some sort of outbreak of a disease in your local area, you may look at vaccinating to prevent it coming into your flock. Or if you've identified a disease in your flock that you're actively trying to remove with a treating or culling or vaccination program. Great. Okay, well, thank you for listening to that sort of formal part of the presentation. If you're looking for some more information, please check out our Southeast Local Land Services Facebook page. I regularly post chicken-related content on there. Yeah, I'll hand back over to Alex at this stage, and also looking forward to answering some of your questions a little bit later on. Thanks, Alex.
Okay, thanks, Lou. So I'm just going to share a video that we have from Wendy Hutton. A couple of people have got their hands raised. Tanya is one. I'm just wondering if you do have your hands raised, if you could just type your question into the chat box, and then we may be able to address your question. So I'll just start this now.
So I'm Wendy. I keep chooks just outside of Canberra. This is one of my girls. This one's the wrong colour because she should be black and white and should be a Plymouth Rock, but occasionally we get funny colours. We keep chooks for eggs and for meat, and we sell point of lay pullets, eggs and roosters. We mostly incubate the eggs and off you go. We incubate the eggs, the chickens come out and we put them in a brooder. When they're big enough, they go into a covered run, which means they don't get birds of prey predating on them. When they get a bit bigger, they come into the chook yard, where they get one of the 4 coops to live in together. Usually we get 12 to 18 or 19 chickens out of 20 eggs in the incubator. Incubator, you need to buy a good incubator. The cheap ones on eBay tend not to work very well and you don't get as good a result from them. Once the chickens are in here, we keep them in different coops. We have 4 coops, and the laying hens free range into the paddocks all day, and then they come home at night because we want them fox proofed. The outer perimeter of the chook yard has an outrigger on the top to stop anything going over the top. It's made from temporary fencing, which is supported by star pickets, has mesh at the bottom to stop the chickens coming out, and the mesh goes underneath to stop the cats and foxes digging under. We have large wild cats and we have foxes in numbers around here, and so far this chicken coop has not lost any. The pen has 4 coops and 4 runs, and the inside section has a mouse-proof storage area for feed. We keep the feed in a mouse-proof area because you just can't keep rats out of anywhere where you've got feed. The chooks use a step-on feeder because that doesn't leave a lot of food around for the rats and mice. The chickens are not heavy enough to do that, so while they're too small, they get a tubular feeder that we make out of plumbing pipes, because we can put a lid on it. Rats can't get in the top. We lose a few to rats just getting into the bottom where the chickens feed, but if we keep the rats down, we don't have a big problem with them on that. And that's just about it. Collect the eggs every day, keep it clean using wood shavings in the nesting boxes. Because I raise Plymouth Rocks, they're very large hens, so normal nesting boxes are usually too small, so I use pet carriers that they seem to like, but the big hens won't fit into grass catchers from lawnmowers or normal size coops, and they get a bit restless if the laying box is not tall enough for them to walk in.
Okay, Luke, have you got your video on there? Or can you pop your video on? Great, okay. And Wendy, have you got your video there? video on. So just bear with us while I just turn on Wendy's video. Wendy, are you there? Can you hear us?
All muted, I think.
All right. Just bear with me for a second. I'll just try.
I am.
Oh, good.
Muted. Sorry.
Oh, good. We've got you now. Yay.
I was reading notes. I was reading chat and forgot that my sound was muted.
Oh, good. Oh, God, I'm glad you're reading the chat box there, Wendy. I guess what I neglected to say was that I actually had a chance to come out and visit you Friday a week ago and spend some time with you, and that was a lovely video that we prepared from your farm. So I'm going to. Would you like me to screen share some of those photos now, Wendy, and we can have a chat about those, and then we'll do a question and answer session. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, sure, that's good.
Okay, all right. You just jump in whenever you need to, Lou.
No problem.
All right. So just bear with me there for a second, and I will share my screen. And there we go. We've got Lou. And we've got a little picture there, Wendy, of your chickens. And can you tell us a little bit about Cluck Norris and your chickens there?
Okay, so Cluck Norris is a show quality Plymouth Rock rooster, but he's very young. He's still a bit gangly. He hasn't got his full comb. He's part grown. He weighs more than 3 kilos already. And when he's fully grown, he's going to be a very big boy. And on the right-hand side, we have the current second grade juveniles, bigger juveniles. So they're in one of the coops in the chook run. And there's another batch a bit younger who are still in the covered pen. So
Okay.
for that one.
Yeah. And this is, do you want to talk to us about the brooder boxes and the smaller pens that you've got there?
Yeah, okay, so these brooders, this one is a 20 chicken brooder, and the other one you can see in the photograph, the bigger one, is a 50 chicken brooder. I can't get more than 20 under the 50 chicken brooder because my chickens are so big. I use the 21 for the chickens for the first week, and I keep them in a very small container on a table where I can get to them easily and keep an eye on them. But after the first week, they're too big for that, and they go under the big brooder into the coop on the right-hand side of the picture. But I keep that indoors, so the temperature stays fairly stable in my studio. And when they're, in my opinion, big enough to fend for themselves, they go out into the covered coop.
Okay.
In summer, they don't need the coop on the right-hand side. They can go out to the covered coop immediately when they're about a week old, because I keep a rabbit hutch with the big brooder out there as well.
So you've got heating outside.
Yeah, yeah. The rabbit hutch gives them a covered space to be in with the brooder inside, and that's in under the cover of the chicken coop that's outside too.
I'm just going to make a little comment. I'd love to make a comment here if I could. For people looking at strategies of how they want to set up their brooder. And I think the fantastic thing about these little things is that they give off heat without giving of light. And I have seen a lot of setups where people use just an electric light bulb to create that heat effect. The problem that you get is that chicks, they really need to sleep to be healthy and to grow and to develop their sort of normal behaviors and be calm. And if you're using an electric light bulb, they're in light all the time, and it really disrupts their sleeping pattern. So something like this, which is giving heat but not light, is really fantastic.
Yeah, I've tried the lights, the infrared lights, and also ceramic heater, really designed for reptiles. It also doesn't have light, but they give a single source of heat, whereas these give a widespread, and every chicken can be under it and warm at any time they want to be.
So, Wendy, I'll just go back to Mr. Norris. How did you decide what breed that you wanted to raise in the Canberra area? Was there any decision making around why you chose Plymouth Rock birds?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There are many breeds. I've had the light Sussex, I've had the Rhode Island Reds over the years, various others, and they're all nice. All chooks are fun.
Yeah.
But the Plymouth Rock were bred specifically to deal with cold, and where we are, we can get -9 overnight. And I wanted a hen that was hardy for cold. Our chicken coop is insulated, so that once I close the doors, the chooks warm it up quite nicely at night. But having chooks that I know are fairly cold resistant was why I selected the Plymouth Rocks. They're also big, good egg producers and good meat producers. And to Linda, yes, I do sell point of lay pullets when people ask me for them, and I have available.
Okay. So I've just moved it on to the feeders for chickens there, and you talked a little bit about this one, the grandpa feeder in your video, but this is the smaller version for the smaller chickens that you've actually made that.
Yes, we make those out of plumbing fittings, and the reason for having the restricted opening is because all chooks tend to chuck their food around if you let them. So when you have a feeder that's open, you'll find they'll throw the feed everywhere, whereas this one with the little hole in it means they have to put their head in and peck the food out, and it doesn't get thrown every which way. Behind that feeder is the rabbit hutch where they have their brooder.
Right, okay.
And that spreading of feed is, I'm sure you'd agree, Wendy, that's what brings in your wild birds looking for all those bits and pieces, and that's a real biosecurity risk there, and a waste.
Yeah, so I guess on that point, Lou, what sorts of things could the wild birds bring in that would be a problem?
Yeah, so definitely parasites will hitch a ride. So, lice and mites will hitch a ride on birds that go from one flock of chickens to another. And there's the potential for particularly diseases that might actually have an impact on people as well. So avian influenza is one that could be brought in by migratory birds that then mix with your own flock. So respiratory diseases and parasites,
Okay. So we did talk a little bit about these nesting boxes and rodent-proof pen. I remember when I came out to visit Wendy that there was you showed me a plastic bin that had been actually eaten through by the rats. So this is your design here that you've done in the middle of your chicken pen set up to keep the rats out. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, the chicken pen is based on a 5.5 by 5.5 carport that we've enclosed, but there's a 2 by 2 concrete slab in the middle.
Yeah.
And that has this framework around it, which has the mouse-proof, and it's expensive wire, but it's mouse-proof, and that goes over the top and all around the sides, and that door is covered in it too. So hopefully it is rat-proof. Certainly they can't get through the holes, but there's plenty of airflow. And to Ian, the Plymouth Rocks drink a lot more water in summer, but they cope with the heat as well.
Oh, great. So you've just answered Ian's question, have you? Because he had his hand raised. Yeah, great. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to just stop my screen share now, and hopefully we've got Wendy and Lou on the screen. So we did have a few questions. I'm just going to have a look at the chat box myself as well. Oh, okay. So
as chooks get older, they tend to lay larger eggs. I've
yeah.
had a few fairy eggs. I haven't had one that produces fairy eggs as consistently as this one. But I think if you're just patient and you give your fairy eggs to kids who find little eggs much easier to handle. When my kids were small, I had quail because the quail egg was not scary and not too big. So I would just feed them to little kids because that'll be fun.
Yeah,
Okay.
I read that question as well, and I think it may have had something to do with sort of pre-laying nutrition or just be specific to this particular bird. But I agree, Wendy. I haven't really heard of one that stays as a fairy size for 4 months. But I think, you know, it may just be normal for her.
So there's a question there about what sorts of cover crops could be planted for the southern tablelands, and I think this is kind of a little bit related to the question there from Gareth, which from Ian, which was what would be the effect on laying hens if they were on pasture only. So that was from Ian, and it's sort of a little bit related to Gareth's question there.
So I'll make a comment on that. Chickens can't live off pasture only. They're not herbivores, they're omnivores. They have a requirement for protein that just wouldn't be able to be supplied by grass. Although grass does have a reasonable protein content, it also has a really high water content. So they physically can't eat enough grass to supply their nutritional needs. The benefits of pasture are all your micronutrients. So getting that really sort of healthy green stuff in their diet is fantastic for the micronutrients. But for the macronutrients, where you're looking at energy and protein, pasture is really not sufficient. You need to be looking at grains and essentially meat-based protein products or replacements for that, such as soy, to have a balanced diet. You know, looking at growing a cover crop, you know, great idea for having them somewhere where they can express their natural behaviors and peck at that. Something else that might be worth looking at is something like starting a mealworm farm or something like that, which has really good protein content for them and something to add into the diet that you can do yourself.
Some of the commercial people, seed people, sell what's called various versions of clacka-tucka. You can plant that as a supplement for your chooks, but you need to put it in a place that's covered and away from the chooks until it establishes, and then they'll eat that. But once again, it's not a complete replacement for the grains and things that you feed to your chooks.
Okay, all right. So Lou, I'm just wondering if we could ask the question, are there any disease symptoms that look like molting? And Lorraine had one that's related to that, which are what are the common diseases, which I think you've covered a bit off on in your presentation, but I just wonder if you could address those.
So I would say sort of generally in chickens, and Wendy can talk about her perception of health in chickens as well, but I think a lot of the diseases look very similar. Like, it's quite hard to say in a chicken, number one, when they're sick, often they don't look sick initially, and then they are only showing signs when they are quite unwell. And lots of different illnesses sort of present in the same way. So you're looking at things like, the eyes go a bit dull, they're inactive, they don't want to eat, they might have runny droppings and just look a bit, we call it the sick bird look or the sleepy bird look. And the different illnesses are going to all look pretty similar. In terms of molting, so if she's molted and isn't bringing her feathers back in again, so she's lost feathers but new ones aren't coming through, there's a possibility that the nutrition isn't supplying her needs to actually build those new feathers. So looking at your protein content again, and maybe other micronutrients like iodine. But also you want to check that those feathers are actually molting and not being pecked out by the other chickens. So having feathers pulled out by other chickens might look like a molting chicken. I mean, Wendy, tell me what you think, but I would suggest that chickens, you'll generally have a few that are molting at the same time, but if you've just got one that's missing feathers, you might be looking for someone who's bullying her.
I had 4 missing feathers, and the 4 of them were having their feathers picked out, one worse than the others. It took me a couple of visits to the pen at night to isolate which hen was doing the pecking, and then put her into a separate coop and prove that she was the problem, and then put one of the ones that was being picked back into the coop with the one who was suspect and prove that it was, and then unfortunately she had to go because I couldn't cure her of picking, and then I needed the others to get feathered up before winter, which was a bit sad. Otherwise they'd be wearing knitted coats by now, but luckily they did cover up. So yeah, one hen can get a really bad habit, and I don't know a reason why they get this bad habit, but once they start picking, they will not stop. And they knock off the feathers on the back and on the tops of the wings, and it's quite nasty.
So that's a bit related to a question here, Wendy, from Sarah, which was, I'm wondering if you process your excess roosters yourself and what becomes of your older hens.
Okay, so excess roosters, if no one wants to buy them, are humanely slaughtered and put in the freezer and shared with friends and family, and form part of our diet. Older hens just live out their lives. Plymouth Rocks will live for 8 to 10 years, and they will just keep going.
Right.
Nobody gets slaughtered because they turned old. They just get to have a retirement.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. So I think there's a question here that we probably won't be able to address, Lou, but the question was from Katie. Do all the things you said refer to guinea fowl and ducks as well?
For the most part, they will do, but in terms of the sort of regulation side of things, what I would say is probably the differences are going to be mostly around nutrition. And but in terms of regulations and biosecurity, they'll be similar. The vaccines for those animals will be different. But yeah, I think I'll sort of take that on notice. I'm happy for Katie to get in touch with me for her specific situation.
Okay, cool. And another question for you, Lou, from Kayla. I've heard the use of ivermectin pour on is common to deal with lice and mites, not mice. Can you give any information about this, please?
So ivermectin, the chemical, is effective to kill those pests. However, it is not registered to use in chickens. And so if you are using it, essentially using what's called off-label. So that's using it contrary to the usage instructions. If you're just doing that for your own home backyard chickens and a vet has given you sort of the instructions and the clear withholding period for that, that's okay. But you can't use that product if you are selling the eggs on for human consumption or selling the meat on, because that's not registered in chickens.
Okay. And another one for you, Lou, from Katie, and I'm not sure about the background of this, but is Condy's crystals in chickens' water, is that a myth or does it actually work? Is that to do with the changing the colour of their feathers, or I'm not
Used
sure.
for, as far as I understand, it's used for internal parasite control and general health. And it's a, you know, sort of, I suppose, I would describe it as an old wives' tale, but I suppose that old wives' tales came from somewhere. It probably does do something to reduce the number of pathogens in the water itself, but I think there's probably better methods to manage health in chickens that maybe is even safer than using Condy's crystals. Wendy, have you ever used Condy's crystals in the water at all?
No, but cider vinegar is also touted as a way of cleaning out the insides and helping chickens to drink more, because the little chickens want to drink more if it's got cider vinegar in it. I think the jury's out on exactly how beneficial that is. And so
I think
once every 6 weeks or so I give them some and cross my fingers.
Yeah, I think probably there is a benefit with cider vinegar, that it acidifies the water. It probably reduces sort of, you know, bacteria and just improves the water quality essentially. Chickens do need very high quality water. So you probably are just giving them a cleaner water to drink by using that apple cider. I agree with Wendy. I think in terms of what its benefits are internally in terms of parasite control and gut health, we're not really sure yet.
Okay. So Melissa's got a question, and it comes to feed. Her question is 100 grams of layer pellets per bird per day about right? So I think perhaps that comes back to, do we ad lib feed and the types of devices that we use to feed the animals to keep them keep the feed quality good. Do you have any comments on that, Lou? And then I guess we could toss over to Wendy.
Just in terms of how much to feed, it's going to be very dependent on what the feed is. So my understanding is that chickens, their appetite is sort of based on whether they're getting enough energy from the feed. So a low energy feed, they're going to be looking for more of it. If it's, you know, particularly high fiber but not a lot of energy in there, they're going to be looking for more. If it's high energy, they'll eat less of it. It's a bit of a trial and error to work out exactly how much of everything that they need. Wendy, do you find that if you I'm not sure if you're making your own ration or if you're purchasing feed, but does the advice on the bag, does that correlate quite closely with what your chickens need, or you just sort of work it out as you go along?
The commercial layer packs have 20% protein, and that's what I feed to my birds. I feed whatever they think they like, so I try different brands, and when they eat a lot of it and say that's yummy and don't throw it away, that's what they get for a while, and then I change to give them a break. That makes them happy hens, but as I said, mine go out on the pasture all day and they still come in and eat the layer mash that I put out for them, or pellets or whatever they're into at the moment. But 20% protein seems to be the requirement to make eggs. They won't lay if they don't get enough protein.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and there was a question in the chat actually that said, what is the ideal protein percentage for pasture egg layers? And it's sort of working out what works best for your flock, what their requirements are in terms of what else they're getting in terms of supplements. But I would say 16% would be your absolute minimum. So 16% to 20% is probably where you're looking.
Okay. So protein, meeting their protein requirements, particularly for layers, is particularly important there.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Production is something that is over and above the normal maintenance of life, and you're asking these chickens to produce something all the time, and production is driven by protein.
Yeah. So Narcy's got a question here about, are chickens with feathered feet, like silkies and faveroles, more susceptible to mite infections? I guess that's for you, Lou.
I'm going to throw that one to Wendy. Have you had feathered feet chickens before, Wendy?
No, they've never appealed to me. Mine have all been big birds and not feathery ones.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry.
I guess I'm just sort of thinking that possibly they've got more bits of them that will pick up the mites. You know, that if the mites are on the ground or something like that, they're more likely to pick them up on the feathers. But it's not something specific that I've heard. And I think as long as you're kind of managing your biosecurity from wild birds, you shouldn't be having a problem.
So Katie, all chooks will get fat if you feed them fatty foods. If you give your chooks too much bread, they don't get enough protein, they won't lay so well, and they will get fatty. So you just feed them a proper feed with 20% protein, and then they won't get fat.
All right, so I'm just going to check in with everyone here now. So it's 10:30, and we do have a few more questions. Are you comfortable to keep going? Just answering a few more questions for us, Wendy and Lou?
Yeah.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, so to our participants, if you want to stay on the line, just stay there, and we will aim to have everything wrapped up in about 10 minutes or so.
Yeah. So Lindy, my chooks don't like pellets most of the time, and I just feed them the grain mash that doesn't involve pellets, and sometimes you can get grain mash mixed with little bits of pellet stuff, but my chooks don't like that either, so they just get the straight grain mix.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask one to Lou now, Wendy. Are there any particular types of birds that are more likely to carry avian diseases to chickens?
Yes, I mean, I would probably, the safest option is just to assume that all wild birds are carrying something, and act accordingly to that, particularly with parasites, because the parasites are specific to the chickens. They're just using the wild bird as transport system. But in terms of high risk, what we call the high risk zoonotic diseases, migratory water birds are the ones that we're particularly worried about. So those are birds that could be bringing avian influenza, for example, from elsewhere in the world and bringing that to Australia. And there are migratory routes that do cross over Australia in certain parts. So that's what we have concerns about in terms of what we call zoonotic diseases, so diseases that can transmit from animals to people. There are systems in place monitoring the migratory birds that do come to Australia. But yeah, in terms of some of the more common diseases that are already endemic, I would just think, you know, watch out for any wild bird contact.
Okay. So Wendy, there was a question there from Andrew about, do you sprout grains?
No.
Or you don't?
No, but I pull up weeds from my garden and give them lots of greens, and then they run around outside all day getting lots of greens.
Yeah. Okay.
I think the jury's out on that grain sprouting as well. You know, if you're interested in it, just do a lot of reading, because the grain, in order to sprout, is using up its own energy reserves. So there is, we're not really sure if it's increasing. I think it probably it's possible that you get better micronutrients in there because those micronutrients might be more available to the bird, but the overall nutrition may be different to what you sort of think that they're getting. So not sure on that one, but really investigate it. Don't just sort of go, oh, someone said this is great, do it. There may be some nutritional changes in that product as well.
Okay. So Elsie has a question about electric netting and foxes, and we'll just let you know, the audience know, that we will be addressing this particular question about production and foxes for small scale farms. But do you have any general observations about that at all, Lou or Wendy? If not, we can just put that aside, and I will just let you know that we will be talking about foxes at some point in the future.
You can buy fox lights, which flash all night and look like people walking around the paddocks, but if you don't move them regularly, the foxes will start to ignore them. Electric works with foxes if it's in the right place and doesn't get shorted by grass growing up. So you need to maintain your electric fences quite regularly to make sure they're not missing, but very little will stop a wild cat.
Okay.
And I think unless you have built Fort Knox like Wendy has, I wouldn't probably rely on any sort of one thing or one gimmick or approach to foxes are really clever, and they will come and test. Your electric fence may be working 360 days of the year, and the other 5 days the foxes will come and test it and they'll get in. So I think there isn't really one easy solution to foxes. You have to look at all of those things that Wendy was talking about: high fencing, with the overlay at the top, with the electric fence, know whether they can get in. It really, they're very, very clever, foxes.
They're also very unpredictable. They're territorial, and they don't come every day. So you can't set up a pattern of looking for them. But at another workshop I went to, using night cameras, you can find out when the foxes are likely to be around, and you can start to think about how you control them if you know what their pattern of being in your vicinity is.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll just move on from that now. And there is a question, Lou, I don't know whether you can answer or not. We may take it on notice. It's from Joanne. We run a commercial dairy farm, and our son runs a small egg business on the same pasture. There's some rules about salmonella regulations that state chickens can't have access to other animal manure. Do you know anything about that?
I would have to look into that specific change so that I'm not giving the wrong advice, because I think that's quite a new regulation. So again, maybe Joanne could send an email and I'd be happy to follow that up.
Okay. All right. And you've answered the one about the chicken scraps. Oh, there's a question here that we discussed before we went on air, which is the ratio of roosters to hens.
So I look at that as maximum 10 hens per rooster. But if you have fewer than 10 hens per rooster, the roosters tend to get feisty and difficult to control.
Okay. Do you rotate or rest your yards at all, or do you have birds in them the whole time?
I do rest yards. I've got 4 pens, so I can keep different places, and I don't always have juveniles. So that gives me, and I don't always have roosters, so that gives me 2 pens that can be rested on a regular basis. And if I think that one of them needs resting and cleaning out, I can close it off and just use the other 3 coops, or however many I need at the time.
Okay.
It's really good for worm control, parasite control, to be able to rest spaces so they're not on the same ground all the time. And that's one of the great benefits of having something like a chicken tractor set up as well, is being able to move to clean ground.
So there's just a question there to you, Wendy, about how do you get 20% protein from a grain mix? Is that from a grain or a pellet?
No, it's from a grain, but you buy it.
It's pre-mixed, is it?
Yeah, it's a commercial mix.
Okay.
There are several brands that do grain that are commercial, and there's a place in Fishwick that does, Bell Chambers has their own mix. So quite a choice of different ones.
Okay.
I noticed a question there, Alex, from James about buying and building coops in domestic environments. And I was just going to make the comment, number one, definitely talk or get the regulations from your council first, because they may have rules about how close to your neighbours you can actually build and how high. And then I would just make a comment as well, don't assume that you do not have foxes in Canberra. You definitely have foxes in Canberra. And also you
lots of them.
Yeah, lots of them.
Right.
And you do want to think about ventilation. Ventilation is a really important part of building your coop, and it's also going to reduce the potential impact of smell on your neighbours as well. You don't want to have that sort of ammonia smell. And ammonia building up within a coop is quite toxic to yourself and also your chickens. They won't do well if they don't have good ventilation.
So there's a question about isobrowns there.
Yep.
All chickens originated as tropical birds, which is why we need to keep them indoors in winter and most of the time protected from the weather. So your isobrowns are no different. Chickens tend to be fully feathered when they're about 6 or 7 weeks old and can be outdoors. But outdoors doesn't mean in a tree overnight in Canberra in the frost. They do need to have well ventilated but snug quarters at night, so that they can snuggle up and get warm together. And your isobrowns will need to be warm together at night.
Okay. Is there anything else, Wendy or Lou, that you wanted to share with our audience today? I'm wondering if you could if you wanted to share that now. Is there anything we haven't touched on or that you really wanted to get across that we haven't had a chance to say?
I feel like we covered a good range of topics there. I hope everyone enjoyed that discussion. Wendy, did you have anything?
I'm just a resource. I play with chooks.
Okay.
I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, look, it's been a wonderful discussion. So thank you both very much for your time. I'm just going to share my screen again now and just finish it off here. So just bear with me for a second. Whoops. So just wanted to tell you a little bit about our feedback. After the webinar, there'll be a post-webinar survey. So it'd be wonderful if you could please fill that out. And you can also send me an email at admin@smallfarmscapital.org. And I'll be happy to answer your questions and also to receive your feedback. And just to let you know about our upcoming webinar next week, on Saturday, the 4th of July, we've got Dr. Jason Conda joining us, and we'll be talking about acid soils and filling the bare patches in your pasture. So we're really looking forward to that. And if you would like to find out any more information, Lou touched upon our website before in her presentation. I will have all of our webinars up on our website very shortly. We're just putting up a new website. And there will also be links to these recordings from our webinars, and also a lovely video, the lovely video from Wendy. We'll have links to that to YouTube, and also some of the other work that Lou has been doing with us as well. So thank you all very much for your time today. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Lou.
And thanks, Lou and Alex.
Thanks,
Yep.
everyone.
Thanks,
Alex,
everyone.
I just popped my email address into the chat box as well for those people that had some questions that we didn't cover today.
All right. Okay. Fantastic. Okay. All right. I'm going to sign off now, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Thanks.